Hi, everyone. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the Consent Management Decision Enforcement Services and Computable Consent Track. And in this session, we're going to do participant demonstrations. I published a list of use cases related to what we're going to demonstrate as part of the LEAP FHIR consent project. And each one of those will be addressing patient privacy, which is looking at an exchange of healthcare information between two entities. And then we'll also look at advanced care directives, a treatment consent use case, consent, and typically that's an informed consent implementation. We'll look at research for clinical trials. We've got a clinical trial loaded into the system. And we'll also look at DNR and PULSE, the National Portable Medical Order. We spent some time yesterday during session 2 in the deep dive, actually going in and taking a look at the LEAP consent management UI, and we created several consents for one user, but we have a test user that we created and populated his clinical data using Cynthia. This is all modeled after advanced care directives in the state of Arizona, as well as it uses a pseudo implementation of the Healthcare Information Exchange Health Current. So basically, this is what I'm going to be demonstrating. We're going to go through how I tested, and we'll look at the consents, and we'll actually make some changes in the consents where we're failing for whatever reason, right? And that could be that the consent, the test is actually a place where we wanted the patient to decline or revoke that consent. We'll look at those areas. So let me switch screens here. Is anybody else going to present their services or their systems in this area today? Am I it? And if I am it, there's an opportunity for us to have Mohammed go a little bit deeper into the LEAP consent decision service, which I think would be valuable to the community. Any comments on that? Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let me get out of this screen. So we're looking at the LEAP consent UI, and this is our demo patient 1, Lorena. She's 50 plus years old in the state of Arizona. She's created a suite of consent directives for advanced care directives, for living will, power of attorney for healthcare, for mental health, do not resuscitate, a portable medical order, national portable medical order. She's created a consent for treatment, one for research, and a patient privacy, which is an exchange from her primary provider, which is the Mariposa Community Health Center, and the HIA, which is Health Current. Okay, now based on our, so I'm going to drop out of this and go into our test platform. Let me stop sharing here. Let's go back. So from our our list of tests that we wanted, or use cases we wanted to test during this Connectathon. Basically, I took the test messages, which are part of the Leap Consent UI deployment for this Connectathon. You can find that in the GitHub repo that we identified during the orientation meeting. Those messages, I created a collection inside of Postman so that we could test each one of those messages interactively for a given patient and look at the outcomes of each. So in each case, I'm testing, and this is an any-to-any for purposes use of treatment of a patient privacy exchange, where our patient Lorena, identified by her social security number, has already created a consent. So basically this is how it flows. And then what I do is I actually test the response from Mohammed's consent decision service on whether we're receiving a consent permit, a consent deny, or no consent. So I'm testing various areas. And let's go back. So as you can see, we've got our 23 test cases. I'm trying to describe it here. So this is an any organization for purposes of treatment, emergency treatment, or coverage. And then we have one specific to the exchange, the patient privacy exchange that Lorena created for her community health center to the HIE for purposes of treat and body structure. And we'll get into these a little bit deeper. We've got the advanced care directives. This is kind of a generic request. And the reason being is I did not implement subcategories in the consent as far as ACD. And we want to talk about a little bit on our touch point at end of day, the kinds of things we need to see in categories. We have the use cases for treatment. They're based on a medication request for a antidepressant, where Lorena has granted consent to administer that drug to her. We have the research use case for a clinical trial at Arizona State University that is for pre-diabetics, basically. So, and then we've got DNR, do not resuscitate, and the portable medical record. So I'm going to go ahead and run these. This is called Postman, by the way, the tool that I'm using. So I'm going to go ahead and run those tests. And it's going to make each one of those requests to Mohammed's Leap Consent Decision Service. And we're going to, let's do the summary. And it will tell me whether I'm receiving back what I expect or not. The green means it's passing. If it's red, it means it failed for whatever reason. Okay, so we ran all 23 test conditions, and 3 of them have failed, but why have they failed? So let's start at the first one, which is the consent to treat. And let's look at what we're expecting there. So let's dive deeper into the actual request that we sent in. So we're sending in a request for purposes of treatment for this specific provider. Let's see, the category, the consent category is treatment. The class of information we're asking for is medication request. And the patient identifier here is their social security number. And the response, let's go ahead and run that and see what response we get back. Okay, so we're getting consent permit here. Now, what are we actually testing for here? We're testing for, let's see, am I looking at the right one? Yeah, consent permit. Our test, did I pull up the right one?
I think you wanted 13.
Oh, I wasn't I? Okay, I'm sorry. The test here is we're looking for a consent deny because we're testing for whether the informed consent was declined. Okay, so let's do something here. Let's revoke that consent because we're coming back if we run this request. If we run it, we should come back with a consent permit, correct? But we're looking for a deny because we're assuming that the medication request was declined. So we have a permit here. So let's stop sharing here. Let's go back to the UI. Oops. Okay, so can everybody see my UI? The leap consent UI now?
Yes.
Okay, so I've selected that consent. And let's actually take a look at it. This is an informed consent that she has created to allow the prescribing of Zoloft for her. Okay, so this is coming out of medication request. Let's go ahead and revoke that consent. Oops, got to actually touch it. Okay, so that's revoked. It should show up in my revoked list. Here it is. All right, so now let's jump back to the testing screen. Okay, and let's rerun that test. And now we come back with no consent. So no consent is the same as a deny. Now, had she gone through the process, let's go ahead and actually recreate that consent. And this will take a little bit on my part. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to share, go back to my share screen. Sure. Let's go and manipulate that record so we can see the behavior once we create that consent again. So I'm going to go in and actually modify that medication request and put it back on hold so we can go through that process again. But this time we'll decline it. So let's update it. So a lot of the behavior in managing consents is updating the status codes of various FHIR resources. So right now you see that when we revoked it, it set the status of that medication request to rejected. In other words, the patient rejected the informed consent or excuse me, we had an existing consent and we rejected it and it pushed it out all the way out to the medication request. So let's go ahead and update that. Oops. Oh. That's interesting. No. Okay. Well, we'll come back to that one. Let's see. So let's go back to our test script. And let's look at the other failures that we had. Let's see. So send that. Testing for. So this is a similar case to the testing for decline in the consent for treatment. We're looking for a deny here. So what we'll do again is we'll revoke the research use case. And so I'll go back there. I'm sharing. I apologize for bouncing around. This is just how it unfortunately plays out. So we've got let's see, we're going to active. We're going to revoke the research. Okay, so that's gone, it's revoked. And let's stop here, share again, Postman, share. And let's come back in on this request. We're looking for a consent denied that it's now that it's been revoked. No consent. So again, no consent is the same as consent denied. And the reason why it's coming up with no consent is there's no other consents within for this patient that are related to the category of research. So so that worked out okay. Let's try to change this one. Let's go back to consents. And let's go through that whole process where it's declined. I'm going to stop sharing here. Sense. There we go. Okay, so let's search for our test patient. We'll go find that research consent. We're only looking at active consents at this point for this patient. Okay, and that's gone. So let's go ahead and update the research subject. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna set research subject back to back to a potential candidate. Let's make sure we're looking at the right patient. We are. And we're going to change. You see, when we rejected it, it changed the status to withdrawn. We're going to call it, set him back to a potential candidate. And then what we'll do is we will create that consent again for the research subject. So let's go back in. Now we have a thing called notifications, which actually queries the system and based on a suite of rules determines if you've got any requirements for consent. And that could be driven by a clinical trial or medication request or service request. So I'm going to go ahead and go through that process again. So here's the informed consent. I'm going to look at that form exactly, review it. And this, and again, this is a pre-clinical pilot study on physical activity for pre-diabetes. So I'll read all the information related to that. I'll go ahead and decline this time. I do not want to participate. I'm going to accept that. And it shows here on the consent, the human readable portion of it, that I've declined it. Okay, it says that successfully created it. Let's see. And so let's go to our test again. And let's rerun that. And this time we should clearly get, again, no consent. So in other words, it's not, when it created that consent, it created it in a rejected form, a status of rejected on that consent. Go back to the FHIR screen. Where we at? Now this time we want to look at all. And we can see the one that we updated here. Let's just, whoops, a little ahead of myself there. Let's take a look at the status of that. So that created, when I declined the informed consent, it created a rejected. Mohammed's tool looks at only active consents, and since there was no active consent for this clinical trial, it comes back with no consent. So any questions on that? I know I bounced around a lot, but this basically shows how we within the LEAP project utilize computable consents for making authorization decisions.
Hey, Dwayne, this is Kathleen. It's kind of a naive question probably, but in your estimation, is this how a production system would work, or is this just to show how it'd be possible to do it? I mean, would you have a drastically different, or would it be sort of on steroids, or sort of like if this were really working like in an HIE or something, do you see it being much different than what you did?
Well, you want to see all the stuff I showed you, right? There wouldn't be, we wouldn't be bouncing around and doing testing. There would be a patient,
yeah, no,
there
I
would
get
be a
that part.
patient that, see, from a patient's perspective, let's go back to this, that really what they're saying in the activity log is, that people are accessing my data, and they're either being granted access or denied. So if we bring up the list here, which is probably substantial for this patient from all our testing, you're going to see effectively the FHIR audit log, right? Because Mohammed inside the LEAP consent decision service is auditing every authorization event, okay? But from a production standpoint, you have to think about all the services that are behind this. What I'm showing you within the UI is basically me exercising those consent management services. And what I was showing you with the test platform was the end result of what that consent means in a computable form. Do I get a consent to access this information or share this information with my HIE, right? So I don't know. Does that answer your question, Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, some of this is to make, sorry, second candy. Some of this is to make it visual for us, but the services that you're showing us would be what would be behind the scenes of a production system. It seems to me is what you're telling me, which I hope to hear anyway. So yeah.
Yeah. We were not tasked within our project to actually build a full-blown implementation.
Oh yeah.
But I gotta tell you, it's a small leap to actually push these services into production and implement these capabilities.
Good to hear. I had a use case, maybe it kind of, but I keep running it through my brain, where it's a purpose of use not to do something. The purpose of use is to prevent harm. So the purpose of use is to permissibly interfere with exchange. So I'm just wondering that, I guess that would come up as a deny.
Yeah.
Probably, yeah.
Exactly. Now, in the model that we implemented, it has a base for the patient privacy exchanges. It's based in on an opt-in model. So the default policy is basically if your purpose of use within the request is treat or e-treat, emergency treatment, that you're granted access if you're a known entity, right? So you've gone through, in a full-blown implementation, there would be an OAuth authorization to access the service, and making you a known entity. And then if you're able to assert those two purposes, you are granted access to that data. And then the subsequent provisions are typically constraints on those individuals that are exchanging. So in the case of this test patient, they've built a consent that limits not only sensitive information, but also only specific data classes are shared. In other words, they're disallowing the sharing of specific, like family history, body structure, research, etc. And we kind of went through, the constraining specific data classes in session 2 yesterday.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, so that pretty much ends my portion. Are there any other areas that people want to look at within our consent framework while you have us on the line? Okay, so one more thing. Let's see, where is this coming from? So this afternoon during the DS4P participant demonstrations, we're actually going to do a deep dive into how lead consent is utilizing the security labeling service to identify sensitive conditions or resources within their clinical record. So I'm going to be talking about that, how we did it. There is a quote unquote poor man's SLS that we've provided as part of the LEAP framework. It effectively does pattern matching. In the case of the UI, we don't ask it to actually label the data. We just need to know whether or not that data is sensitive or not. So we've got hooks in there for bringing in specific clinical type files, a V2 message, consolidated CDA, a FHIR resource bundle. We can talk through the FHIR API to a FHIR enabled HIE and pull in specific data classes for of the patient's clinical record. And then we can process those using a suite of adapters to basically decompose the data and do pattern matching against that sensitivity value set that is now, what, 6 years old, Kathleen? That somebody needs to update. I don't know if you guys have further.
Yeah, no, it was, the last time it was touched is once in 2017, and the main work was done in 2016. And I was involved, and I know I'm not an informaticist, and I know Serafina is not an informaticist. So it was never validated. It's not complete, and it's totally obsolete. So it's a big problem. And we had a pretty interesting discussion the other day. It was Laura from MITRE. She made a suggestion, which at first I thought was kind of didn't quite grok, but I think she had a really good idea. And since we're doing this in PP2, in the protecting privacy, promoted interoperability, we're looking at the value sets and sort of saying, we wrote a paper about this whole issue of it being, obsolete. How to approach going about creating a replacement. And she had suggested looking at USCDI. And at first I was going, well, USCDI is only going to be what you need for information blocking until, when it's 2022. And then it's the whole designated record set. But that's not a bad idea because the USCDI is supposed to evolve along with, it's eventually should be the designated record set. So if you took chunks at a time and said, we're going to go through social determinants of health was one of the USCDI. data classes, and we're going to collect, and they're basically doing this. We're going to collect all of the codes that talk about social determinants of health. And then what we're doing at PP2PI is developing a decision tree, and the decision tree kind of plays on NIST, privacy and security risk assessment, to go through and say, for this particular data element, what are there risks to it? And we're doing it by use case. So the first one was the mom babe one, where we looked at an EHR, we looked at the data elements that were showing up in the EHR in the nursery record about the mom. And for each one of those elements, having a clinician who's going through and saying, if somebody sees this particular, it's called it's a rating, they call it TPAL or something. It's a thing that this code that they use to talk about a woman's reproductive history. They would, if they look at this, they would know that she had had abortions. So that's sensitive. If they look at the blood type, that might not be sensitive, but maybe it is if there's an odd blood type and the father's got a different blood type. So they actually went through and talked about the context in which this data element, in a lot of times there's other data elements, but this data element should be flagged as possibly sensitive. And then you go through a decision tree that kind of says, what is the risk level? And could it be mitigated? And sort of come up with a way to take all of the SDOH data codes and put some in the bucket of, well, generally these are sensitive based on real clinicians and real informaticists looking at them, and then take that to VSAC and get them put in. So, and get maybe even ballot them or something, get community buy off that these are sensitive things, but take it in the chunks of US CDI. So anyway, I think it's a good idea, and we're working on it. And hopefully, then you can replace your sensitive, the consent to share sensitive conditions with something that is validated and approved by the community.
Right, it's hard to offer up the patient community something, a capability like this to analyze their data if what we're looking at is not current or valid. So
yeah, that is a problem.
Yeah. So are there any more questions? Anything else? Mohammed, did you want to maybe talk about CDS? And
Yeah, I'm happy to take questions if there's any interest or curiosity about certain details there.
I did have a quick question. I did notice it looked like you're using a CDS hook to invoke the consent check. Was that just a convenient way to do it, or were there?
So we did, we did think about what kind of interface we should use, and the traditional interface to inquire about access control decisions is XACML. So we supported that. The other interface that was very close semantically to what we're doing here, which is basically making a decision about basically communicating a decision by a clinically informed engine in the backend, was the CDS hooks interface. That's why I mean, the interface itself is not really important because it's just a formality. Whether it's coming, like whether the request is coming through a CDS hooks or an XACML interface, ultimately it will be transferred into an internal representation of the request, and it will be processed identically either way. So we could support theoretically any other interface as well.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Convenient exchange pattern. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid just like coming up with our own made up REST request format.
Yeah.
Anything else? I'll see that we have a wider group of participants compared to yesterday. So if anyone is curious, we have about 15 minutes to get into further details if you have any other questions, Also, if you are working with the consent service, and if you don't have a demonstration to show anything live, but you would like to talk about your use case or talk about the system you've implemented or planning to implement, feel free to speak up.
Hey, this is Lorraine. I'm over at CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, and I work with the PASSIO group. And we're actually presenting the Advanced Directive Interoperability work, which is somewhat similar to what you guys are doing. There's a little bit of overlap as far as, authorizing consent and getting DNRs and sharing that information, not only with the patient, but, family members or next provider. And so I didn't know if you knew about that track. I think they're doing an overview coming up. But it would be interesting to, cross paths or connect at some point.
This is Kathleen. Corey comes up, Spears
Yes.
talks to us at the security working group. So that's where we kind of keep up with what's going on there. And it's great work. I mean, I think there's a lot of collaboration we could be doing.
Good.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Yep.
Okay, well, if there's no other questions, I think we can end this session. We're meeting again at 1 p.m. or excuse me, 4 p.m. Eastern time, and basically just to touch base and close things out and prep the report out to the working group. Thanks for
Dwayne.
yeah.
Oh, just this, Kathleen, did you record this? And
Absolutely.
okay, well, I was just going to ask also, maybe we can talk offline, but the Zoom will have the list of participants and the recording, and then I can put it up on the security workgroup site so people can get back to it after, or further your report out. So just trying to take care of administrative fee. All right.
Great. Great. So again, we're going to be demonstrating the SLS integration for Leap Consent Analyze My Data functionality on Mohammed's DS4P session that's coming up in 15 minutes. Is that right? So we'll see you there. Thanks everybody for joining.
Thanks, Dwayne. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Interesting stuff.